Good day. Today is Sunday, 26th January 2025. Later in the programme, as I regularly now do, I will discuss the military situation in Ukraine. But suffice to say for the moment, that today Ukrainian sources are reporting that the small town of Velikaya Novosilka in southwestern Donbass has now fallen completely into Russian hands, that resistance there has collapsed, and the Russians, for their part, these are unofficial reports from the Russians, they're claiming that the city of Toretsk is now fully under Russian control and that all remaining Ukrainian resistance in Toretsk has ended. So if these two reports are true, then in terms of military developments, this has been an extremely consequential day. But let's turn first to the many other topics that we talk about on these programs, and specifically, always, of course, they bring us back to the subject of the conflict in Ukraine. And yesterday, towards the end of the afternoon or the early evening, it was interesting to see how after several days of confusion and uncertainty and assertions and denials, suddenly, on the part of the media, the fact that there has actually been some form of major suspension of aid to Ukraine finally hit home. And we had dramatic headlines about this in, for example, places like the Financial Times. It reported that US officials push to exempt Ukraine from Rubio's foreign aid freeze order, support for schools, hospitals, and economic development in Ukraine at risk from Trump administration order. We then go on to read about alarm across the State Department bureaucracy on the part of US aid, the fact that this decision has been made, the fact that stop work orders are now piling up, and that organizations in Kiev itself, and I suspect this probably means Ukrainian organizations, are now also starting to be affected by stop work orders. And apparently the terms, the language of the orders are, the contractor shall not resume work until notification has been received in writing from the contracting officer that this stop work order has been cancelled. And the Financial Times is telling us that there's all sorts of officials are shocked and pleading for this order to be reversed, specifically with respect to Ukraine. It's worth saying that this order does not just affect Ukraine, it affects the vast majority of recipients of US aid, Egypt and Israel being the exceptions. But it should be stressed that, of course, Ukraine is the key geopolitical area of conflict at the present time. Taiwan is also a recipient of US aid, and apparently aid to Taiwan has also been suspended. But then Taiwan is a rich place. Ukraine is not. So there is now concerns and warnings, officials and NGO staff in Ukraine, where Russia's all-out war will enter in fourth year next month, have warned that without a waiver from President Trump's new Secretary of State, programs such as support for schools and hospitals, as well as economic and energy infrastructure development efforts, are in jeopardy. A program director at an NGO working in Kiev said the funding freeze could be a disaster for their group and for Ukraine. And at the same time, the Financial Times is careful to say that they've been receiving confirmation that military aid is continuing. A Ukrainian government official with knowledge of the matter confirmed to the Financial Times that US military assistance did not fall under the freeze order. Military aid to Ukraine is intact, at least as of now, and it is certainly not part of this 90-day freeze. And Zelensky himself, speaking at a press conference with Moldovan President Maia Sandu in Kiev on Saturday, we'll discuss that rather interesting meeting later in this program. He also said that the stop order had not, for the moment, stopped military aid from flowing. And he went on to say, I am focused on military aid. It has not been stopped, thank God. So all very dramatic, but one way or the other, even if military aid does not appear to have been suspended, I still qualify that a little, because we've had reports like the one from Politico, which suggested that some levels of military aid might be. And it's always worth bearing in mind that military aid is supplied through many different programs, and different agencies are responsible for it. And what I think is indisputable is that the main part of the military aid, the part that flows through the Department of the Defense, that is not affected. But anyway, we see here Zelensky putting the best spin on the latest events and saying that he's focused on military aid. It has not been stopped, thank God. Now, Viktor Orban, a few days ago, actually, made an entirely valid point, which is that to a great extent, so far, in terms of its functioning as a state, Ukraine barely exists at the moment. It is entirely dependent on financial flows from the West. The West pays the salaries of the soldiers. I believe it pays the salaries of many of the civil servants. It covers the salaries of many of the pensioners. It essentially supports Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian civilian economy, even as it provides Ukraine with the military aid it needs in order to be able to continue to function. And if I have to say it simply, a permanent cut-off of financial flows from the United States, if this is where we're heading, would be for Ukraine a very grave problem. I'm not suggesting, by the way, I don't think it would be a terminal problem. The European Union would presumably continue to provide whatever aid it can, so would Britain. And, well, governments can sometimes get by, even in the most desperate situations. There is a risk, if financial aid does fully dry up, that the country could collapse into hyperinflation, something it would have certainly done long ago had not financial assistance at critical points been provided, just saying. But anyway, for the moment, we will see. Whatever the resilience of the Ukrainians, whatever the resources the European Union is still prepared to throw, it does seem as if this is a problem for Ukraine. And of course, if this continues beyond the 90 days, then given the level of Ukraine's dependence, it could become a very serious problem indeed, one which would have severe bearing on Ukraine's ability to continue to function and to operate as a state. Now, I should say that perhaps unsurprisingly, over the last couple of days, the idea of of confiscating the Russian assets in the frozen Russian assets in the West has floated up to the surface again. The CEO of Euroclear, where the largest amount of these frozen assets are to be found, 190 billion euros apparently, has once again come out and spoken out strongly against this idea, which suggests that it is again being discussed. Now, Trump's envoy, General Kellogg, didn't seem to think, when the question was put to him, that this was a particularly good idea at all. But who knows? Maybe Donald Trump, the man who breaks all the rules, all the rules in politics and many of the other rules as well, he will decide that this is a quick, neat, simple way of divesting America of the whole problem, seize the Russian assets, give the lot to Zelensky, tell Zelensky that he can use that money to buy arms wherever he wants, including, if he prefers, from the United States, and the United States is thereby rid of the whole problem. I'm not saying that's going to happen, and Donald Trump himself has not said anything to that effect up to now. I don't think, by the way, that it would be at all a good idea for the many reasons I have discussed in the past. It would be, to be clear, a massive violation of international law. It would be an action that would deeply antagonize the Far Eastern and Middle Eastern depositors in American bonds and European bonds and that kind of thing. But having said that, I don't think it is beyond the realm of the possible that Donald Trump might do something like this. Just say. Anyway, there it is. That's the situation with the stop order, Rubio's stop order. If American officials are pleading for it to be suspended with respect to Ukraine, which clearly they are, for the moment at least, it looks as if Donald Trump is absolutely standing firm on this decision. Rubio shows no sign of relaxing the terms of the order, and Trump made public comments yesterday in which he confirmed that the stop order, as it applied to all sorts of countries, is currently in place. We will see what US Secretary of State Pete Hegseth does about arms deliveries to Ukraine over the next couple of days. I'm not sure whether the stop orders and the executive order from which they derive applies to military aid. We're told repeatedly, perhaps too much, that they don't. But we'll just have to wait and see what Pete Hegseth does. For the moment, my own guess is, and has been, that the military aid will continue to flow. Well, let's get back to Zelensky. Zelensky was in Kiev meeting with Maria Sandu. Maria Sandu has been put in a very difficult position by the fact that Ukraine has ended transit of Russian gas through Ukrainian pipelines to Europe. Moldova, which has issues with Gazprom of its own. It hasn't paid, or at least Gazprom says it hasn't paid. I'm sure it hasn't paid for gas that it acquired. Anyway, Moldova has been short of energy, and of course Transnistria has been going through a deep crisis, and Sandu and Zelensky went out of their way over the course of this meeting to blame Russia, Putin for the whole problem. Again, I'm not going to explore the arguments that they made. I mean, it's the kind of arguments you would assume that they would make. But one way or the other, they said that it was the Russians, it was Putin who was somehow to blame for the fact that the transit deal, that Ukraine refused to extend the transit contract that it had previously had with Gazprom and things like that. Anyway, more interestingly, Sandu and Zelensky came up with a very complex proposal whereby Ukraine apparently is going to support Moldova. And from what I can tell, he's going to supply coal, which I would have thought, with more and more coal mines falling under Russian control across Ukraine. But anyway, he's going to supply coal to Moldova, to a particular thermal power station there. That will apparently suffice to provide energy to Moldova and perhaps to Transnistria as well. So we're told. And in return, Moldova will export electricity to Ukraine. The idea that Moldova would be in a position to supply much in the way of electricity to Ukraine seems to me a surprising idea. But anyway, that's what Maria Sandu and Zelensky said when they were together. But Zelensky also said some other things over the course of yesterday, over the course of these meetings with Sandu. And he touched on the topic of his September 2022 decree prohibiting negotiations with Russia whilst President Putin remains president of Russia. And it was a most interesting example, again, of Zelensky at work. Firstly, he said that the decree had been drawn up at the time when the Russians were at the gates of Kiev, and that he had decided to make that decree to make it absolutely clear that no Ukrainian officials, local or regional officials, were authorized to negotiate with the Russians. Only he, Zelensky himself, as president, would be able to negotiate with the Russians. And that this was supposedly the purpose of the decree. Now, what is confusing is that I vaguely remember that back in February or March 2022, some such decree was actually made in Kiev and signed off by Zelensky. I'm not absolutely certain about this, but there were general fears in Kiev at the time that the Russians would make approaches to local regional officials in Ukraine, in the various regions, and offer to negotiate with them, and that the result would be that there would be a cascade of regions starting to make deals with the Russians separately and independently of the central authorities in Kiev. Now, there was some apparent attempts to that effect by some Russian authorities, by the Russians in some places. There are reports, for example, I remember them at the time, that the Russians did make some kind of an outreach to the regional authorities in Kharkiv to see if they could be persuaded to discuss directly with the Russians. how to, agree whatever terms that the Russians might have for Kharkiv region and for Kharkiv city specifically. Those discussions went absolutely nowhere. And again, I seem to remember that, however, in some other places, in Donbass, and in some other parts of Kharkiv region as well, including, if I'm right to remember, it might have been Kupiansk or some other places. In a few minor places, discussions like that did take place, and in one or two cases, some local officials did have some contacts with the Russians. But overall, nothing like that took place to any great degree, partly because, as it turned out, the Ukrainians, the Zelensky government, did have effective control over the entire country, a fact which surprised many people, including to some extent myself, but perhaps even more so because the Russians, their priority in March, April 2022 was not to negotiate with regional leaders, but to negotiate with Zelensky himself. And in fact, we now know that on the very day that the special military operation began, one of Putin's key officials, Dmitry Kozak, who had represented Russia in the trilateral contact group that had been set up under the Minsk process to try to find some way to agree a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. Anyway, Dmitry Kozak telephoned the Ukrainians on the Kremlin's behalf the day after the start of the special military operation and said, look, this is not over. Let's talk. Let's still see if we can find some means to compromise. And very quickly, negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians were set up, and they took place first in Gomel in Belarus, and then they were transferred to another place in Belarus, and then they eventually were transferred again to Istanbul, and then the negotiations, as we know, failed. And an agreement was largely reached. It was initialed by the two sides. The Financial Times was briefed in detail by the Ukrainians about the contents. But the British objected. Boris Johnson went to Kiev. The Americans weren't too happy. And the thing fell through. So, what happened at the time of the Kiev events, the time when the Russians were outside Kiev, really has absolutely no bearing on the actual decree that is the one that Putin repeatedly refers to, which is the decree that Zelensky issued most emphatically in September 2022. And that not only prohibits regional and local officials from negotiating with Putin, with the Russians and with Putin, certainly whilst Vladimir Putin remains Russia's leader. The decree, the September 2022 decree, prohibits Zelensky himself from engaging in those negotiations as well. I remember reading the decree at the time and being incredulous at its contents, and I seem to remember some Western commentary expressing concern about the contents of the decree at the time. Now, this is a classic example, again, of Zelensky in action, because what he is in effect doing is that he is signaling absolutely clearly that he has no intention of reversing any decree, be it a completely defunct decree written, signed off by him in February, March, April 2022, which has long since been overtaken by events, or the far more important decree, the really relevant decree, the decree that he signed in September 2022, the decree that forbids everyone in Ukraine, including himself, from negotiating with Putin, and which is the decree that Putin himself is constantly bringing up. And again, it's classical Zelensky. He tries to muddle things and confuse people. He sends people down, false paths, diverting attention from the relevant decree itself. But the key thing to understand is that the decree that he's talking about is the September 2022 decree, the decree that Putin is talking about is the September 2022 decree. And if you get through the maze of obfuscation and confusion that Zelensky is creating here, the point is that he's refusing to revoke it. Now, given that that is so, I would have thought that already puts the whole process of negotiation in jeopardy before it has even begun. Now, Donald Trump, on the 23rd of January, gave an interview with Sean Hannity on Fox, which was quite interesting in some respects, because over the course of it, Trump said some rather interesting things about Zelensky himself. He said that Zelensky was no angel. He said that Zelensky had made a serious mistake to walk away from the Istanbul deal, the deal that had been virtually agreed in April 2022. Trump, again, seems unaware of the role that the US government of the time, which is to say the Biden administration, played in sabotaging that deal, and of the role that Boris Johnson played in sabotaging that deal. Perhaps he doesn't want to refer to Johnson because Johnson is or claims to be his friend and has been a vocal supporter of Donald Trump's and actually attended his inauguration ceremony. I believe he was in the rotunda on Capitol Hill when Donald Trump was inaugurated, just saying. But anyway, Trump basically put the whole blame for the fact that the agreement, the Istanbul agreement that was initialed, the fact that that agreement in the end collapsed, that was a mistake of Zelensky's. It was Zelensky's doing. It was all ultimately his fault. And Trump went on to make some rather important points, observations about what a catastrophic mistake that had been, that it had meant that Ukraine found itself in an indefinite war with a vastly more powerful country, that the United States had sent weapons and machines to Ukraine to try to assist Ukraine in that war, and the Ukrainians had fought bravely and used most of this equipment well, but nonetheless, and notwithstanding, the far greater military power of the Russians inevitably over time has begun to tell. And, well, Trump gave the very clear impression to me over the course of that interview with Hannity that he would have taken the deal. that, as far as he was concerned, that was for Ukraine a good deal. Now, that is very interesting, because if Trump thinks that Istanbul was a good deal in April 2022, why would he think that Istanbul Plus is not a good deal now? A good deal for Ukraine, perhaps, but for the United States also. Just saying. If Donald Trump thought it was a mistake not to take Istanbul, why would Donald Trump not take Istanbul Plus? After all, what is different between Istanbul and Istanbul Plus is that Ukraine is going to have to cede far more territory than it would have under Istanbul Plus, than it would have had to cede under the original provisions agreed in Istanbul. If we go back to the Istanbul proposals, we've never had them published, not so far, by any side. Someday they will be, and we will see what they say. But my understanding of the Istanbul agreements is that the two regions of Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, plus Crimea, would come under Russian control. Just saying. And I mean the entire regions. I know there's been some suggestions that the Russians would have retreated to the February 2022 ceasefire lines. I do not believe that to be the case, by the way, nor do I believe that it would have been the case that the Russians would have been prepared to give up claims to control the entire two regions of Donbass. But Ukraine would not be required to recognize these territories, Donbass and Crimea, as Russian. It would receive security guarantees from various states, including Russia itself, and these security guarantees were crucial because they provided the guarantor powers, of which Russia, of course, was one, with the right to veto deployment of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory and the establishment of foreign bases on Ukrainian territory. But anyway, there would have been guarantees provided to Ukraine by a group of countries, of which, as I said, Russia would have been one. China, and I seem to remember Brazil, would have been others. And, of course, the Western powers would also have been guarantors. The guarantees would not extend to Crimea and Donbass, whose final status would be decided by future negotiations. And in addition, there were, of course, the key, the absolutely central demand made by the Russians and agreed by the Ukrainians, that Ukraine would not pursue NATO membership and would enshrine neutrality in its constitution. There were all sorts of other provisions as well about rights of Russians, size of the Ukrainian armed forces post-war, things of that kind. Some of these remain to some extent in contention, though not, it seemed, in very bitter contention. But in essence, that is what I understand Istanbul, the original Istanbul agreement, to have been. Now, if we look at Istanbul Plus, it is harsher, but harsher in ways that do not fundamentally diverge from the original Istanbul. So Ukraine, as it agreed in Istanbul, would once more become a neutral state. It would give up its project of entering NATO once and for all. Apparently, Istanbul Plus envisages sharper cuts to the Ukrainian military. The question of guarantees, security guarantees for Ukraine, is apparently one which would be looked at more holistically in the context of looking at security guarantees for all of the states in in Western Eurasia, with guarantors drawn from Central Eurasia. So China would be involved. There would be other things of that kind. But anyway, I suspect that fundamentally the question of security guarantees is one that could still be negotiated. The major difference, the key, or at least the visible difference between Istanbul Plus and Istanbul is that, of course, the Russians today control far more territory than they controlled in April 2022, territory which goes far beyond Donbass, and are claiming even more and are saying that this territory is Russian and therefore cannot be subject to further discussion or negotiation. The Ukrainians will simply have to cede it. And of course that includes the four regions: Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson. Now, why should that concern Donald Trump? Why should Donald Trump, if he feels that Istanbul was a good deal and that Zelensky made a mistake to walk away from it, object to Istanbul Plus simply because Istanbul Plus gives the Russians significantly more territory within Ukraine? It might be very difficult for the Ukrainians, and it would be extremely difficult if they were to lose Zaporozhye and Kherson regions in their entirety, which under Istanbul Plus they would be obliged to do. So that would mean that the Russians' control would be in effect in control of all of the southern reaches of the Dnieper, reaching up to central Ukraine itself, and they would presumably also obtain control of the great industrial city of Zaporozhye. Just saying. So it would be a body blow for Ukraine, at least pre-2014 Ukraine. But why does any of this concern the United States? Why would it be a problem for Donald Trump personally if the Russians control more Ukrainian territory as a result of an agreement entered into today than they would have done if an agreement had been reached in April 2022, an agreement which Donald Trump now clearly gives the impression that he thinks Zelensky made a mistake in not proceeding with. Now, I say this because I'm wondering whether when everything settles down, when the dust settles, we're going to find that after Putin and Trump meets, the movement of the negotiations will be increasingly away from these strange ideas of freezes, ceasefires, European peacekeeping forces, that sort of thing, it will start to move inexorably towards Istanbul Plus. And I say that for one very simple reason. Donald Trump, again, over the course of his interview with Hannity, seemed to say that it was now necessary to end the war as quickly as possible. And again, he's basically putting the onus on Putin to end the war. But that, of course, empowers Putin and gives Putin leverage over Trump. And going back to what I said in a program I made recently, the Russians by now must be starting to say to themselves, well, maybe, just maybe, given how eager Trump is to do a deal, we can insist that the deal that is done is the deal that we have proposed. In other words, that the war is settled on our terms, on the terms which we know as Istanbul Plus. Just saying. That is Trump's easiest, simplest, fastest way of ending the war. And of course, Zelensky won't be happy. He will protest furiously. The Europeans will be horrified. But without the United States, what realistically can they do? And already, as we see, with the stop order on aid to Ukraine, the squeeze is on. Now, the Russians have been, again, looking at all of this, and they've been keeping careful watch on everything that is happening. And, well, there's been some commentaries about the recent events in the Russian media. And we've had commentaries in two Russian newspapers, Izvestia, very famous Russian newspaper, created at the time of the Russian Revolution, and for many, many years, the official organ of the Soviet government, just saying. And the other is the official government newspaper, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, which is today's government newspaper, just saying. Anyway, Izvestia has made a really interesting point, which is that Trump's message on Truth Social, the one threatening sanctions, was different in some ways from some of Trump's other comments addressed to other countries, Canada, Denmark, Panama, which is that it is unusual. The first thing that stands out is the tone of the message. When Trump initiated bargaining with Canada and Mexico on revising the existing bilateral agreements, he did not waste time offering compliments. And then Izvestia goes on to say, the second thing is that Washington has no effective leverage to influence Moscow. Russia-US trade has dropped significantly, declining sixfold in the past 4 years. Russia's main exports to the United States include enriched uranium, with temporary restrictions imposed by Moscow in November, currently in effect, palladium, mineral fertilizers, and aviation components. Replacing these supplies fully or partially will take much time. Besides, Trump has neither technical nor political ability to immediately increase military aid to Ukraine. So, the ability to increase military aid, which is what the Russians might have been most concerned about, it really isn't there. At least that is the Russians' own assessment. And then, as often happens, Izvestia consulted an expert, Vladimir Vasiliev, who is a senior research fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute for United States and Canada Studies, an immensely prestigious institute, by the way, just saying, in Moscow. Anyway, and it quotes Mr. Vasiliev as saying, "It's for Trump, it's crucial to release funds and resources from the Ukraine track. The problem is that in the current situation, Washington's respect for its obligations can only be based on Trump's personal assurances because we won't have any international legal guarantees. Those could include a decision by the UN Security Council, but that doesn't look strong given how the organization is viewed at the moment. This looks similar to the situation around NATO's eastward expansion. This discussion is about a ceasefire." So what Vasiliev is saying is that Trump is desperate for a deal. It's crucial to release funds and resources from the Ukraine track. But the problem is that he can't deliver. He can't provide the kind of legal guarantees that the Russians are looking for. So he is coming to the negotiations with a weak hand. He can't increase military support for Ukraine, and he can't give the Russians the cast iron guarantees that they are seeking. But he is urgently in need of a settlement. Well, we have the other Russian newspaper, Rossiyskaya Gazeta. Which is a government newspaper. It's interviewed various experts, contacted various experts, and they discount the potential for new US sanctions. And then, of course, again, we have the expert, Boris Mercouris, professor at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Philosophy, another very, very prestigious institute, by the way, is confident that US sanctions themselves are not as important as they used to be. What is especially dangerous is US pressure on neutral countries in order to drag them into the war of sanctions against Russia. The expert explained that it's not customs tariffs that Moscow should be wary of, but active and unscrupulous diplomacy seeking to blockade Russia. But then another expert, Dmitry Novikov, head of the Scientific Educational Laboratory of Political Geography and Modern Geopolitics, we do get these clunky institutes in Russia as well, believes that potential US actions won't be aimed at expanding the existing range of sanctions, but at tightening their implementation by other countries. However, such an approach may turn out to be harmful for Washington's relations with those nations. And this is the key point. So the Russians have looked at Donald Trump's hand, and they see a weak one. They see a president who's anxious for a deal. They see a president who is not really in a position to step up military aid to Ukraine, as he says. Already, Ukraine has been given pretty much everything that it can be given, and it's impossible, realistically, to give much more. Trump may threaten sanctions, but when it comes to sanctions against the by the United States against Russia, there isn't much more left to sanction. And if we're talking about secondary sanctions, both Vasiliev and Novikov and Mercouris, all of these three experts, see the immediate problem here as the fact that it puts the United States on a collision course with large numbers of neutral countries who have wanted to trade with Russia up to this time, and who will undoubtedly want to continue to do so. Countries like India and China and Saudi Arabia. And of course, the point about these countries is that they are, in many cases, friends and allies of the United States, and are countries that, in the case of India and Saudi Arabia, the United States might not want to antagonize. In fact, there's been an article in the Financial Times which says that whenever the United States does try to intensify control, push up tariffs, control of trade, push up tariffs, increase taxes, impose restrictions. The article doesn't talk about sanctions, but it applies to sanctions as well. The response of the rest of the world is very simple. It's not to comply or even outright defy these moves. It is to bypass them. The article, which is by Ruchir Sharma, reads, "The world is moving on to trade without the United States." While Donald Trump is yet to act on his multiple tariff threats, it's likely he will. So the fear lingers that the US president's aggressive trade posture will slow global disorder, depressing growth and roiling markets, particularly if targeted nations retaliate. But retaliation is not the only or even the most likely response. The US has wielded tariffs as a weapon for 8 years now. Those imposed by Trump in his first term were mostly continued or, in the case of China, expanded by Joe Biden. Some nations retaliated, others offered concessions or challenged them before global trade arbiters, but most quietly moved on, seeking trade with countries other than the United States. Since 2017, Trump's first year in office, trade has held more or less steady at just under 60% of global GDP, but there's been a decline in the US share of trade flows, offset by an increase in other regions, particularly the nations of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So there it is. What a further sanctions offensive, secondary sanctions by the Trump administration against Russia, what it would do is simply redirect trade in ways that bypasses what the United States is doing or trying to do. That has been the consistent pattern going all the way back to the original tariffs that Trump imposed back in 2017. And it's been true with the sanctions as well as the tariffs that Biden imposed. And if Trump imposes more sanctions and more tariffs on the Russians, well, that is what is going to happen also. This article in the Financial Times is another fascinating example, by the way, of how this whole question of the reordering of trade to circumvent the United States, which is taking place in the world, is discussed at length in a long article in the Financial Times without the BRICS group being mentioned once. The fact that, as I said, one of the key players in organizing the redirection of trade away from the United States is BRICS, is nowhere mentioned in this article. Well, there we are. So we have a situation where the Russians have read what they think is Trump's cards and they sense that they are weak. They are still apparently waiting to hear from Trump and his people. There's been no, even as of the time of making of this program, the Russians are still saying that they've not had any direct contact from the administration up to now. In the meantime, we've had all kinds of signals from the administration. There was the ultimatum on Truth Social that Trump gave a couple of days ago. But then we've had the stop order on aid to Ukraine. We've had this interview with Hannity. So the signals are mixed, but the Russians, at least, I think, are concluding that Trump is keen on a deal, and they are reading his cards, as I said, and I think they think that they are weak, and they've made it quite clear that what they're going to push for is Istanbul Plus. And in his interview with Hannity, Trump, at least, gave the strong impression that he would not be averse to settling the Ukraine war on those sort of terms. Zelensky is, of course, another matter, and the Europeans are another matter still. There is a ferocious editorial in The Guardian today, just saying, basically still insisting that the war must go on until the Russians have been defeated in some form. I'm not going to read the article. The Europeans collectively, and the British still more, will be horrified at the outcome, Istanbul Plus, as the eventual outcome of the war. But to repeat again, without the United States, it's very difficult to see how the war can drag on. It seems to me that if Trump and Putin reach an understanding on Istanbul Plus and Zelensky rejects it, then at that point, based on everything that he has said, Trump will indeed be in a strong position if he chooses to walk away and say, very well, then it's up to Zelensky and it's up to the Europeans. They can sort it out between them. I've done all that I can. I've come up with what seems to me a fair deal, and if the Ukrainians won't take it, then there isn't anything more I can do. They made a mistake in April 2022 when they rejected Istanbul. They will make an even bigger mistake if they reject Istanbul Plus. So that's one possible scenario where we could be heading. My own sense, reading Russian media at the moment and listening to the comments of Russian officials, they're starting to feel increasingly confident that not only is the military situation working for them, but that the diplomatic one is working towards their purposes as well. As I've said previously, it might have been a mistake for Donald Trump to give the impression that he was so anxious for a deal. The Russians have seen that, and they've drawn the inevitable conclusions. Now, of course, lots of other things are happening, and Donald Trump continues to make waves in all sorts of other areas, including other areas of foreign policy. He has had further very bitter comments to make about Denmark and about Greenland, and he has insisted again in the most pointed way that Greenland must eventually come under the control of the United States. The Danish authorities made, I think, a serious misjudgment again when they said that they were beefing up security in Greenland by increasing the forces there by a certain degree, including by establishing 2 dog sledge patrols. Now, that doesn't mean 2 dog sledges. It means, groups of people who will operate, a whole team of people operating with dog sleighs, which happens, by the way, in Russia as well. It's not untypical in Arctic countries. But of course, Trump has homed into that, as he was inevitably going to do, and he's again berating the Danes over this. And there are reports, the Financial Times is again saying that the Danish government is now in crisis, that it has now dawned on them that Trump is absolutely in earnest about gaining control of Greenland, and they are completely besides themselves in Denmark. They have absolutely no idea of how to respond and of what to do. Now, another very interesting thing that's happened is that we've had some information about the people whom Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, intends to contact over the next couple of days after becoming US Secretary of State. And this list, if it is correct, I've seen a list. I'm not going to read it out because I'm not 100% sure that it is correct. But if it is correct, it's going to trigger even more waves of alarm across Europe, because of 22 countries that Marco Rubio intends to be contacting over the next 2 weeks, some are in Latin America, some are inevitably in the Middle East, a significant number are in the Asia-Pacific region. Only one, Poland, is in Europe. It seems that the Secretary of State of the United States, if you believe this list, is not interested in talking to the German or French or British foreign ministers. He prefers to talk to others. Now, he's had a telephone call with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Now, the Chinese and the Americans have each produced readouts. I'm not going to read them. My overall impression is that it was a stiff and far from entirely friendly call. Rubio has a reputation of being an anti-China hardliner. At least that's how the Chinese see him. Wang Yi appears to have gone out of his way to try to see things, shall we say, from the Chinese point of view. The response appears to have been that America is going to prioritize its own interests from now on. And there was, again, the ritual rhetoric about China threatening US allies and acting aggressively in the Pacific, which won't have pleased the Chinese at all. Incidentally, if I am reading this call between Wang Yi and Rubio correctly, then I cannot for the life of me see why the Chinese would want to distance themselves from the Russians. Why, faced by this kind of expression of hostility, they would want, at America's bidding, to take action to pressure their friends in Moscow over Ukraine, potentially annoying and distancing themselves from their own biggest and most important ally. But anyway, it was interesting that that was nonetheless the first call that Marco Rubio made. It appears to have been, as I said, to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The first foreign visit that Marco Rubio is making as Secretary of State is apparently to Panama. And the Panamanian government has been getting extremely nervous and angry about the repeated demands from the Trump administration for the return of the canal. I suspect that on this, Rubio will be coming to Panama bearing an implacable message. Once again, I don't know what the Panamanians are going to do. The reality is, Panama is a very small country. It was invaded by the United States quite recently in 1989, as I seem to remember, during the time of George H.W. Bush. And of course, it was a country that to a great extent was created by the United States in order to build the Panama Canal. The fact is that if the Americans are determined to get the Panama Canal back, the leverage that they can bring to bear against Panama is enormous. And of course, if they want to go straightforwardly and take it, there is very little that Panama can do, just as there is very little that that Denmark can do. If the United States, which has already a strong military presence in Greenland, simply decides to take control of Greenland. I'm not saying, by the way, that the United States ought to do either thing. I think, on the contrary, that such things would be appalling and quite wrong. But the fact is that the United States has the military and economic power to do these things, and countries like Denmark and Panama are not in a position to resist. So anyway, it will be a very uncomfortable meeting for the Panamanians, and one wonders in what mood they will find Marco Rubio when he gets there. And I have to say, it would be a very interesting conversation to overhear. Across Latin America, except perhaps in Argentina, elsewhere in Latin America, the spectacle of the United States beating up on a small Latin American nation would not go down at all well, and it would certainly ring alarms and bring back memories, and it might in time result in further realignments. It might be that more Latin American countries start thinking that establishing contacts with the Chinese and the Russians is a good idea, or it might be that other Latin American countries might say that it is now far too dangerous to establish contacts with the Chinese and the Russians. But one way or the other, as I said, it's interesting that this is the first meeting that apparently Rubio is going to make, and we'll see what the response in Latin America is going to be. But once again, the key thing is America is now setting its own priorities. They're not any longer collective West priorities. The Europeans have no role in what is going on in Panama. They are the losers of what is going on in Greenland. One way or the other, we are moving towards spheres of influence, and the Europeans are looking increasingly as if they're being left out of Americas. And of course, Trump has made a truly astonishing and many will say dismaying statement about Gaza. He's publicly said that maybe the time has come to think about relocating the entire population of Gaza, which he puts at 1.5 million, to Jordan and to Egypt, and that he's already apparently talked about this with the King of Jordan. Didn't say what the King of Jordan's response was, by the way. Anyway, that is his way of solving the problem of Gaza and of the reconstruction of Gaza, which he says is now a demolition site. A demolition site, of course, made so as a result of the fighting over the last year, in which most of the destruction was done by the Israelis, just saying. What Trump doesn't seem to be aware of is that here he's following in the footsteps of none other than Tony Blinken, who I remember back in the first weeks of the Gaza operation, Israel's Gaza operation, was traveling to Jordan and Egypt and urging them then to take in millions of Gazan refugees to in effect agree to the Israeli plan for the displacement of the entire population of Gaza. The Jordanians and the Egyptians absolutely categorically refused. So did the Saudis. In fact, there was huge anger that the Biden administration seemed to be backing this further displacement of people, Palestinian people, by Israel. And I don't think that it's going to be, the reaction is going to be any different this time. Again, if Donald Trump seriously wants to persuade the Saudis to lower the oil price and to cut in favors, then he's going about it in ways that conventionally might be thought to be extremely counterproductive. It's only because Donald Trump is such an unusual political phenomenon that I put some qualification on this. There's always a possibility, I suppose, that things might turn out otherwise, but I can't really see how. Anyway, let's move on and talk about other things. And in fact, let's go back to the war, to the state of the war in Ukraine. Because as I said at the outset of the program, if it is correct that Velikaya Novosilka has fallen, and it is the Ukrainians who are telling us this, and that Toretsk has fallen, and it is the Russians, not the Russian Defense Ministry, but various Russian bloggers and reporting channels and mapping projects, that sort of thing, who are telling us this. Well, if both of these places have fallen under full Russian control on the same day, then this is a big psychological as well as strategic blow for Ukraine. It is in fact a disaster. I would go further. I would say it is a catastrophe. Velikaya Novosilka is a catastrophe. At least 300 Ukrainian soldiers were apparently killed defending the southern areas of Velikaya Novosilka. Probably many, many more have died over the course of this battle. The battle was not pointless when it started. Velikaya Novosilka is indeed an important fortified position which held together the tattered remnants of Ukraine's defenses in southwestern Donbass. Its fall opens the way for further Russian advances towards the Dnieper, and it's been suggested that one thing the Russians might do is take advantage of the fall of Velikaya Novosilka to outflank Ukrainian defenses in the small but important town of Zaporozhian town of Gulyapolye, opening the way ultimately for the fall of Orekhov and the Russian advance to the city of Zaporozhye itself on the Dnieper River. It's also been suggested that advancing north from Velikaya Novosilka, the Russians could outflank the Ukrainian defenses in the Andreevka, Urakli, Konstantinopol pocket, where the Russians apparently have already managed to break into Andreevka itself, and where heavy fighting is going on. Well, as to what the Russians are going to do with the capture of Velikaya Novosilka, who knows? But the point is, it was not pointless, a mistake to try to defend this place. What was a mistake, in fact, it was worse than a mistake, it was a crime, was to defend it for as long as it was defended. Everything that I've heard about this battle suggests it may have been one of the most horrible battles of the entire war. It sounds, from some descriptions, more like a massacre in its final stages than a battle, with small groups of Ukrainian soldiers isolated from each other in this small town, pressed on all sides by the Russians, uncertain what their orders were, whether to retreat or surrender, or what to do, even as the inevitable collapse unfolded around them. But, of course, this collapse, which is the biggest defeat the Ukrainians have suffered since the fall of Ugledar, just in October, has gone virtually unreported in the media in the West. And, of course, if Toretsk has fallen, this is the last big, major fortified position of the line of defences that was created after the 2014-2015 crisis by Ukraine in Donbass, whilst the city of Donetsk itself was hemmed in by Ukrainian fortified positions in places like Avdiivka, Krasnogorovka, the village of Pesky, Kurakovo itself, which played apparently the role of the key logistical centre. The defence lines around the other important Donetsk city that the Ukrainians were besieging, the city of Gorlovka, the major pressure point that the Ukrainians had there was through their control of Toretsk and its surrounding villages, including the town of New York, all of which had been converted into, again, a major fortified area. And all of this has now collapsed. There is now no further pressure directly on Gorlovka any more than there is on Donetsk. On the contrary, it is the Ukrainian positions, remaining Ukrainian positions in Donbass, that are now looking extremely insecure. Chasiv Yar is about to fall. There's been more reports over the last couple of hours suggesting that the Russians have not only captured the whole of the northern part of Chasiv Yar, but that they're also clearing up in the south as well now. Toretsk has apparently fallen. There are reports that the Russians are now starting an advance from Vozdvizhenka, and it's been suggested that this is more connected to capturing positions leading up to an eventual encirclement of the city, the small city of Konstantinovka, which forms part of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, the last major populated part of Donbass still under Ukrainian control. My own guess is that before the Russians focus on Konstantinovka and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, they will first want to resolve the remaining outstanding problem of Pokrovsk, which is also clearly being encircled. There have been reports of more Russian advances through the village of Udachny. Kotlino is now firmly under Russian control, and the Russians have been advancing apparently well to the northwest of Kotlino, coming ever closer to cutting off Pokrovsk's supply lines from the west. But one way or the other, I think that probably my guess is, and I'm not an expert here, and many of my guesses about what the Russians will do have turned out to be wrong. My guess is that the Russians, over the next couple of weeks, will focus finally on ending the Battle of Pokrovsk. And then, once they've done that, that's when they will turn their attention to Konstantinovka, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and when they will properly and fully activate their forces, which are now well established on the west banks of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, capturing places like Kupiansk, Liman, Siversk, by the way, Izium, potentially Balaklaya as well, bringing Slavyansk and Kramatorsk into a pincer, at which point these places will quickly become undefendable as well. Now, none of this, of course, speaks to Ukrainian losses, which I understand continue to be horrendous. And I understand that Colonel Reiner of the Austrian army is now saying that he's not convinced or sure that the Ukrainians, who are rapidly losing their ability to continue resisting, have the 100 days that Trump and Kellogg are giving them in order to make peace, that there might be a Ukrainian collapse within that time. Well, I should say again, I haven't actually listened to Colonel Reiner's program. I haven't been listening to him for a while, by the way. There's just been too much to do, and there have been other, I think, more reliable, or rather, I find more interesting and analyses from people who are closer in touch to events on the battlefronts. But anyway, there we are. That's the situation in military terms. It's not surprising that the Russians currently feel very confident. I've already said that they have read Trump's hand and they read it as weak. They've listened to Trump, and I think what they see him is as someone desperate for a peace rather than somebody who's really going to push through with the threats he's making against them, which he can't fulfill anyway. They're also looking at the military situation, which is rapidly and further moving in their advantage. And of course, all of these events, for all of the various reasons that I discussed in this program, they probably sense that the latest moves by the Trump administration have probably ended up by making their major alliances, most importantly their alliance with China, even more solid than it would otherwise have been. I fully expect that at some point, perhaps next week now, Trump and Putin will speak. And I think that there will be a summit meeting shortly after. My clear advice to Donald Trump would be, if he were to ask me, which of course he won't, is go along with Istanbul Plus. It's the far and away the best deal you can possibly get. The United States makes no great concessions or compromises here. It's not a good deal for Ukraine, but as you said yourself, Ukraine was wrong to walk away from the deal, the original Istanbul deal they had in April. And if the Ukrainians and the Europeans cannot see where their best interest is, that cannot be a problem for the United States. Well, that's my program for today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.